But I have, in the health and wellness space, heard a lot of talk, and I've heard of this study come up a number of times where light is shined behind the knee, and that's actually affecting the internal clock.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this. I think it's important because if we're going to be cognizant of the light, we want to know where it can come in and impact things.
There's two areas of huge problems here. One is a paper that came out in Science in 1998, from a study in the States, suggesting that light behind the knee could shift the biological clock. And this created a massive media storm. And people were patenting light devices. People were going to have little light devices in aircraft seats and all the rest of it. And those of us who've been working in this space were deeply skeptical because we said, well, hang on, how can this work? Because if you don't have eyes, you can't regulate the clock. What's the basis for this? And there was some absurd idea that light behind the knee would liberate nitric oxide from the blood. Nitric oxide would then go to the brain and shift the biological clock. Well, the half-life of nitric oxide in the blood is a few seconds, so it just the whole mechanism is flawed. So many of us were very uneasy about this. And I think it was named, key paper of the year for Science. And I remember going to India and speaking to a wonderful young researcher who came up and said, oh, yeah, you work on light. And you know what I'm going to do my PhD on? It's going to be light behind the knee, regulating the biological clock. And I thought, there's limited resources. Here's an individual's future. And this is the last thing I would put a student of mine on. But it's in Science. And therefore, it's the highest, one of the great journals, scientific journals. And then a bunch of people, as is the nature in science, try to replicate the findings. There were a series of studies which didn't do exactly the same approaches and failed completely. And then Chuck Seisler's group at Harvard mimicked the study exactly with using the same light sort of blankets, the same everything, and failed utterly and completely to replicate the study. Interestingly, the original study is well remembered. All of the studies which showed it was nonsense are not, and that paper's never been retracted. So, yet there is absolutely no evidence for it. You can sort of, and in fact, I was quite irritated because we were working on these non-visual photoreceptors. We'd published studies on mice saying, visually blind mice can still regulate their clocks, and they cited our stuff incorrectly as support for their work. And so anyway, in fact, I'm particularly sensitive to this because I do remember writing a grant to the Medical Research Council in the UK, and the grant was destroyed. And the comments that came back were, why is Foster looking for new photoreceptors in the eye when we know there are light sensors behind the knee? So, I was kind of bruised by this whole thing. So that one is absolutely, convincingly, utterly wrong. The latest reincarnation of this is a device which you pop into your ears and you blast light into the brain and through the ear canal, and that will get rid of seasonal affective disorder, it'll get rid of jet lag and all the rest of it. This too is completely nonsense. They're expensive devices. They made a hell of a lot of money out of this, and it was based originally on a brain imaging study suggesting that there's a brain photoreceptor, because when you illuminate the ear canal, you can see modulations in the electrical activity of the brain. I showed this to, there's a phenomenally good brain imaging group here in Oxford, and I said, what do you reckon about this? They said, looks a bit dodgy to me. So what we did was then repeat the experiment in individuals with no eyes, individuals with eyes, because of course the thought was, well, maybe light's getting through the back of the eye and changing electrical activity. We found through functional brain imaging studies no evidence at all for this brain. We couldn't replicate their original findings, their brain imaging studies, and therefore the basis for this this study. I've read an article. It was reviewed in The Guardian in the UK. And, devices are given sort of stars. This got no stars at all, and it got absolutely trashed. So I think a lot of people have bought it and have been very disappointed. So these things surface from time to time. It is interesting, and it makes a great splash. And then it lingers in the sort of collective memory and sort of really muddies the waters of the real scientific advances.
Do you think there's a chance science will find any other photoreceptors in different areas of the body? Maybe the mouth, the nose, anything that you could think of?
I certainly wouldn't exclude it. I think, as a scientist, you couldn't possibly. And there are some weird, potentially light-sensitive molecules that are lurking around, but they have never been linked to the functions that we've been talking about, the regulation of the clock, levels of alertness, or other sorts of behavioral changes. So I'd never say no, but show me the data, and show me the data that's been undertaken, in a randomized controlled trial, doing it properly. And that's what we lack. And I'm amazed that so much rubbish gets published after so-called peer review. It's very damaging, actually. And it can hurt a lot.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
So the shorthand for melatonin that you read all the time is that it's a sleep hormone, and it most emphatically is not. But what does caffeine do? Well, it blocks adenosine receptors within the brain. So it masks